Hey, good evening. Welcome. My name is Jerry Murdoch. Most of you in the room or the many of you that know me, mostly know me as that guy who's married to Gina Murdoch. But I'm also a board member here at the Aspen Institute and at the Santa Fe Institute and at the Aspen Center for Environmental Studies. This is the second event of the 2015 McCloskey Speaker Series. I want to thank Bonnie and Tom McCloskey family, who are sitting right here. Thank you very much. This is wonderful. So, tonight's speaker, Dr. Eric Smith, has challenged disciplinary boundaries throughout his career. First, as an undergraduate at Caltech, getting his degree in mathematics and in physics, and then at the University of Texas, Austin, where he earned his Ph.D. in high-energy physics while working on string theory and quantum gravity, which was followed by appointments at Los Alamos, and then he spent 11 years at the Santa Fe Institute as a full-time faculty member. During his time at Santa Fe Institute, I had the good fortune to meet him, and in full disclosure, I've been funding his work for over a decade, his work in regards to the origin of life, which we're going to hear about tonight. And while at Santa Fe Institute, he was also doing interdisciplinary work in geochemistry, biochemistry, and many topics related to complexity. Currently, Eric is a professor and researcher at the Earth Life Institute in Tokyo, and he's also an external faculty member at the Santa Fe Institute. His goal is to understand origin and nature of the living state through the many windows that science provides: the physical, geochemical, biochemical, ecological, and evolutionary. Additionally, he remains interested in the connections or correspondences between energy, information, and computation. Most of us think about life as being something created from other living things. But much of Eric's work focuses on the time before biology, when life on Earth emerged from geophysical and chemical processes. The subject of tonight's talk is based on material from his upcoming book, co-written by the legendary biologist Harold Morowitz, which is entitled The Emergence of the Fourth Geosphere, to be published in 2016 by Cambridge University Press. His work disrupts Francis Crick's notion that life was a happy accident. Indeed, the material has consequences for the way we think about the relationship of the individual to ecology. The big picture of origin of life shows that ecosystems, not individuals, are carrying some of the most fundamental patterns of life. Furthermore, the work leads us to understand that the nature of living state is different from the nature of individuality, and that we have been wrongly conflating the two in our understanding of biology. Therefore, we should strive to achieve a more ecology-centered biology to help us guide our life in a more sustainable way within the biosphere. Finally, both his upcoming book and tonight's talk will challenge us to rethink what is the nature of life. Without further ado, let's welcome Eric Smith. Thank you.
So thank you, Jerry, and good evening, everybody. Welcome. You might think, at the least, that the problem of the origin of life, how did life appear on an Earth that previously had not had life, is mostly a history problem. What happened and when and where did it happen? You could go a little bit beyond that, and you might think of it as a problem of cause. How did things happen and why? The argument that I want to make tonight is that we actually need to go further than that the things that we've learned about the sort of technical problems of when, where, and how have caused us to realize that the nature of life is different from a lot of the patterns that we've traditionally used to think about it. Now, the reason the origin of life problem is hard is that we do something in science that we also do in everyday life. We put a big gap between the living things and the non-living things. It's very difficult to see across that gap how something like life could have come from something that was not alive. So when we think about life, we often think about it in these terms. Life is made of individuals. They have agency. Maybe they have purpose or intentions. That gives the biosphere direction. Even if the direction didn't come from the individuals, it comes from evolution. Life is energetic, it's complex, and it's endlessly fascinating. Compare that to rocks. What do rocks do? They just sit there, sometimes for billions of years. So, what I want to argue to you tonight is that the conceptual gap between the non-living world and the living world is not real, or it's not where we have tried to place it in the past. The non-living world is very active. It's richly structured in its activity, and the biosphere, from the beginning all the way to the present, is embedded in detail in the structure of that chemical activity of the rest of the planet. We haven't recognized the connections because our ways of looking have been too small, or they've been too short-term, they've been on the scale of a human life, or maybe we've looked in the wrong places. But particularly in the last 30 years, things that we've learned in a variety of different disciplines are changing the way we ask those questions, and those are the things that cause us to reevaluate what we think the nature of life is and what we're trying to explain. So tonight, I want to cover 4 points. First of all, to understand the nature of life and the origin of life, you have to understand its planetary context. And that context is what I will call a great arc of disequilibrium on the scale of the whole planet. Now, even though that disequilibrium or stress runs through all of the systems on the planet, we can break it apart and we can make it comprehensible by doing something that geologists have done for more than a century. We can divide the planet into geospheres, which are separate domains of states of matter and kinds of chemistry. What we're looking for in the nature of life is actually at the level of the biosphere as a whole, not at the level of its components, of species or organisms or suborganismal components. The conclusion that I want to leave us with at the end of the night is that the biosphere is the 4th geosphere. We should understand it as a planetary subsystem, and we should understand the emergence of life as a stage in planetary maturation, akin to the stages that cause the other geospheres to be separated from each other. So, in classical geology, a lifeless planet can have 3 geospheres. The lithosphere, from the word for rock, is the solid bulk. On Earth, this is almost all of the matter and the mass of the planet. The state of matter is solid, and the chemistry characteristic of the lithosphere is the chemistry of minerals and their changes. Second geosphere is the hydrosphere. This is all of the watery domains. Water chemistry is very special. It's very restrictive, and as we've known forever, water chemistry is fundamental to the nature of life. And it's in part important because of all the things you can't do in water that you have to be distinctive, that life does. The third non-living geosphere is the atmosphere. This is the gas phase. Because it's cool and because it's at low density, there are certain kinds of chemistry that are possible in the atmosphere that are not possible other places. Now, the chemistry of the atmosphere is not actually very much like the chemistry of life, but it turns out that it's really important to the great arc of planetary disequilibrium that will be central to our story. And the 4th is the biosphere. A lifeless planet will always have a lithosphere. If it has enough volatiles, as they're called, the liquids and gases, it can also have hydrospheres or atmospheres. I want to look at the Earth as it is, and everything that causes it to be different from a planet that only had the 3 lifeless geospheres. And all of that difference is what I mean by the biosphere. So it is organisms, but not only organisms. It's all of their ecological relations, it's their history, and it's all the changes that they have collectively brought about in the rest of the planet throughout its history. So it's in the sum rather than in the components that we look for the nature of the living state. So I've said that there's not a gap that separates life conceptually from the rest of the Earth, but certainly the biosphere is different from the non-living geospheres. It's different in many ways, but if we had to choose one that's most important, here's the one I would argue it is. For the other geospheres, the lithosphere, hydrosphere, and atmosphere, we can understand most of them in terms of their structure. For the biosphere, you can only really understand it as an organized state of activity. In order to create an organized state of activity that goes beyond just structure, you have to be in a circumstance that physicists call far from equilibrium, and I'll explain to you in a minute what that means. The important thing is that the disequilibria we need to understand life are not something local. They're not local in space and they're not local in chemistry. They actually are built up on the scale of the whole planet. So to give you a flavor for what is meant by near equilibrium or far from equilibrium, I'll use something that's a little of an analogy, but it's an analogy that's mathematically faithful. Near equilibrium is like the ripples on a pond. There may be activity that's caused by disturbances, but most of what there is to understand can be understood from the structure of the flat surface before you start. This is far from equilibrium. Think of the biosphere as surfing on a continuously renewed wave of energy flow. That energy flow is needed to keep it up where it is. It's needed to keep it organized. Now, it's been understood forever that life requires a flow of energy to maintain itself. But to say that something is required doesn't say that that's necessarily possible. It only tells you what's impossible. Tonight, I want to argue for something stronger. I want to argue that the energy flows on Earth brought the biosphere into existence. It's as if the wave had created the surfer. So traditionally, when we come at the problem of the origin of life from the habits of biology, we ask, where is the surfer and what is the surfer like? What I want to argue with here is that the right question should be, where is the wave? So the story of disequilibrium that makes sense of the origin of life doesn't start on the planet. It actually starts in the formation of the solar system. Now, when we look at the sun, the part we see is the photosphere. Photosphere is relatively cool. It's only about 6,000 degrees Celsius, which is about the same temperature as the core of the Earth, and it looks relatively smooth and flat like you see here, occasional sunspots. But if you were to look at the sun in the X-ray with a movie, you'd find a boiling cauldron of magnetic fluid. Because the sun produces heat and the heat needs to convect, and because it's electrically conductive, you get loops of magnetism that boil up from the interior and whip plasma into the outer layers of the atmosphere. This action can cause the middle atmosphere of the sun, called the chromosphere, to go up to 100,000 degrees or more, and it can elevate the corona to 1,000,000 degrees or more. So plasma at 100,000 degrees emits extreme ultraviolet radiation, and at 1,000,000 degrees or more, it emits X-rays. So if you could look at the sun with a picture in the extreme UV and the X-ray, this is actually what you would find. The activity of a star like this is due to convection and the conductivity of the plasma, but also to the rotation, because this is a Coriolis effect, the same as hurricanes. And when stars are young, when they're born, they rotate much faster and they spin down over time. So when the sun was young, all of this activity was actually more vigorous and more violent than it is today. Now that kind of hard radiation shapes planetary atmospheres, and in particular, it drives them far out of equilibrium from the planet that they surround. So in particular, ultraviolet and above will break water. Water is the H2O molecule where the H's are white and the O is red, and it will separate the hydrogen from the oxygen. Hydrogen is a very light element, and so anything will cause it to escape, and the result is that you leave the oxygen behind. This is actually a satellite photo of the Earth taken with a filter for the emission lines that see hydrogen. And what you can see is that our planet is surrounded by a halo of hydrogen that's continually escaping from it. That turns out to have major consequences, because the rates of hydrogen loss that a star like our sun produces will remove a volume of water comparable to the Earth's ocean in about 1 billion years. So, if you were Venus, which is about our size but closer to the sun and a little bit warmer, or if you were Mars, which is smaller and has a weaker gravity to hold elements, you would have wound up in the condition that they're in today, with no surface water, oxygen left behind that turns the dry surface a rusty red. In about 4.5 billion years, the Earth may be in this condition, depending on how much water is on the inside, which is something we don't know. But for the time being, the Earth is a very unusual planet in the solar system, and possibly more widely than that. But why does any of this matter to the origin of life? To answer that, you need to know a little bit of chemistry, but all you need to know is on this one slide. And it's intuitive, I promise. In the periodic table of the elements, we have many different kinds of animals. Some of the elements have a stronger what's called affinity for electrons than others. And in particular, important to our story, iron is very ready to give electrons away to many other elements. Giving electrons away to something is called reducing that, because electrons have a negative charge. At the opposite end, oxygen is very greedy and will steal electrons from many elements. And so you can see the transfer of electrons from iron to oxygen in the suites of minerals in the world. Iron metal, which mostly doesn't exist at the surface, has all of its electrons, and they're loosely bound, so they make a kind of a liquid, and that's why iron is silvery and shiny and reflects light. If you bring in a little bit of oxygen, enough that there's 1 oxygen atom per iron atom, it will transfer 2 electrons to the oxygen, and we note that with a +2 on the iron and a -2 on the oxygen. And you get this dull silvery mineral called viscite, which is no longer shiny because the free electrons are gone. A little bit more so that you're in a mix between giving 2 and giving 3 electrons away, and you have magnetite, which is black. This is what the original compasses were made of. And if you give yet more, you get this rusty red mineral called hematite, which is one of the elements of rust. Now, as we all know, rust happens, and the spontaneity of this electron donating process is a source of chemical energy. If you look at that at a planetary scale, you realize that what happens is that hydrogen escape is turning our whole planet into a giant battery, because this is how batteries work. You take 2 different elements, one of which gives electrons and one of which takes them, and you force the electrons to flow through something so that you can harness the work. In the Earth, in the interior region known as the mantle, most of the iron is in this +2 state, but near the surface it gets pulled to the +3 state by the oxygen that's continually made available as we lose water to hydrogen escape. Now, on a quiet Earth, that battery would run down, because even though you originally had oxygen to donate electrons at the surface, that would basically weather over, the same way you get a layer of oxide on an aluminum windowsill. The only thing that allows the battery to be continually refreshed is that new material is delivered to the surface of the Earth at the same time as hydrogen is continually scoured away out of the atmosphere. But that redelivery brings a second kind of disequilibrium into the picture to understand the context for life. So if you could look at a cross-section of the Earth on 100 million year time scales, so this is where human life is too short to see, you would actually see cool material being brought down from the surface, and you can barely see in this picture, I apologize for the colors, the yellow heat from the core being boiled up. So the interior plastic rock of the mantle is constantly in convective turnover, driven by this need to release heat. If at the same time you could see the chemical composition of the rock, you would find that the oxidized, exhausted crust on the surface is being pulled down and remixed into the mantle, while the electron-giving iron material in the interior is allowed to come to the surface and make new crust. So when you put all these processes together, this is the picture you get of the big Earth. Convection continually refreshes the surface rock at the same time as the solar radiation pulls the hydrogen away. The important thing is that the new crust is not created uniformly everywhere. It's created in concentrated centers, which are called spreading centers or mid-ocean ridges beneath the ocean bottom. The process of convection causes what are called plate tectonics, the movement of the major plates around. Where they subduct, they create earthquakes and volcanoes, which deliver other concentrated new rock to the surface. And when there are continents riding around on them, they cause continental drift. So this is a map of the bottom of the ocean showing its age. The entire bottom of the ocean gets replaced about once every 250 million years as the continents go back and forth, opening and closing in a cycle. The mid-ocean ridges are these red regions of newly created crust in the centers of all of the world's oceans, and then the blue regions are the old crust that's diving back into the mantle, as they do under Tokyo, where I'm living. Now, the sites where new crust is created are themselves very interesting because you're taking rock that's miles thick and you're twisting it and separating it and pulling it, so they're filled with cracks and pores. And in this domain, seawater invades and it gets chemically altered by the rock. The invasion sites and then the remixing zones where the water comes back up are the places where a battery that accumulates over the entire planetary surface and bulk gets concentrated into these narrow ranges. So this map shows you the same spreading centers, and the little red dots are the places where geologists have mapped out regions of active rock-water interaction. This is a tiny subset of the ones that are believed to exist, but these now constitute the evidence we have about where the Earth's battery mostly flows. And if you look at the electron transfer, if you do a calculation from the interior to the atmosphere, it's concentrated at these little release points right around here. So the importance of this is that this is where stress piles up in the world, even though it's accumulated diffusely. So up to this point, we've closed half the gap. Hopefully, I have convinced you that rocks don't just sit there, that the Earth is chemically active and that it's organized. But before the 1970s, even knowing all of this, and much of this was understood roughly, people still would not have been able to make a connection to the origin of life, because life still seemed so different. What I want to show you next is that's because up until about the 1970s, we thought we understood the nature of life, and our view of life was basically entirely upside down. What's important about the last 50 years is that we've learned about an entire new part of the biosphere that we didn't understand, and we've learned that it's that other part, not us, that gives the clues about where life came from and the real foundations of its nature. So understandably, for most of history, when we think about the nature of life, we think about things that are big enough to see because we didn't have microscopes. And that means the plants and the animals and the fungi. But what these all have in common is that ultimately they're all fed by this green forest here. They all live off of the energy from sunlight. And that's a problem, because capturing sunlight is the most complicated thing living systems do. And so we were never able to surmount that chicken-egg problem. How would you ever get up to something as complicated as the machinery that harnesses sunlight if you needed the sunlight energy to build that machinery in the first place? But in 1977, Jack Corliss, Richard von Herzen, and Robert Ballard led an expedition to the Galapagos Rift, one of our spreading centers, with the deep submersible Alvin, which at that time was new. They were drawn there because there had been measurements of the seawater overlying that were anomalously warm, and so they suspected there were rock-water interactions taking place. But they were completely unprepared for what they would see, both about the geology and about the life hosted there. Immediately after those discoveries, there were new hypotheses about how life had originated that are substantively much like what is mostly believed today. But together with other changes that were going on around the same time in microbiology and molecular biology, they completely changed our understanding of how the biosphere is organized and what was its history. So what Alvin saw, the first discovery, was these thundering plumes of sulfide and heavy metal-rich water coming up from the deep. Where they mix with cool seawater, they precipitate these enormous chimneys that can be 45 or 60 feet tall. this water would poison us immediately because of the metals and the sulfide that it's full of. The temperature differences are extreme. 350 degrees versus 4 degrees makes a mirror under this flange. But the most amazing thing was the animal colonies that live around here. The water would poison us, but it's the source of energy for entire ecosystems like these tube worms and the shrimp that live around them. Now, the red color you see here, even though it looks like flowers, has nothing to do with pigments because there's no light down here. That's hemoglobin. These are the worm's lung that stick out into the water to perform gas exchange. But the most important thing of all about these ecosystems is that the worms don't build life. All of the life is built by bacteria. The worms gather gases that the bacteria use to build their biomass in these shimmering zones of mixing. That was a whole parallel biosphere that was not anticipated. But the Alvin expedition did more than show us that there's more diversity in the world than we realized. Together with the other discoveries, it forced us to reconsider what it is that determines living form. There is a role for evolution in this, but I'll come back to evolution second, because it's actually not our first story. The first story is that some of the patterns of life are written into the rules of chemistry and the planetary energy flows before there's ever material for evolution to act on. The important conclusion in this will not only be new insights about organisms, but also a new way to understand the ecosystems that makes them more fundamental than organisms. So let me talk about typology. Suppose we had to play a game of 20 questions, where I had to learn as much about some organism as possible in the fewest number of questions. What should those questions be? Turns out they would not first be about its history. My choice of the first two would be these. I would first ask, where does it get its energy? Does it get its energy from molecules that give electrons the way hydrogen does, or from molecules that take electrons the way oxygen does? Then second, I would ask, how much do I learn if I only see the organism? Is the organism metabolically complete? Does it feed itself, which is the condition called autotrophy? Or is the organism incomplete so that it depends on an ecosystem to provide it, the condition called heterotrophy, or being fed from somebody else? Because if it's incomplete, then even if I study that metabolism, I haven't understood what is sufficient to make life. So the first thing you realize is that everything we used to think about is down in this one lower right corner here. So they are not the norm. The other thing you realize is that on this side, they're all green, or they eat something green, or something that eats something green. So these are the complicated guys, and they were the ones we were trying to understand from. These are the ones that were discovered in the deep subsurface and the bottoms of the oceans. Now, if we look at the evolutionary view and we reconstruct history, we realize that it's telling us the same story. Of course, people and most of the things people know exist at a little tiny tip of this tree here, and in fact, anything that has more than one cell lives on these few branches that have slightly thickened lines. Everything else in the world is unicells. And before, 600 million years ago, that was all there was in the world. More than that, these are the only complex single-celled organisms. The cells that have the simpler form of bacteria make up the blue and red branches that are the substance of the tree of life. Now, the remarkable thing is, as we have reconstructed the properties of these deep branches from the way their ancestors are left on the tips here, we find that the bacteria that live without oxygen are the good models for the root here, and also many of them are heat-loving. So the bacteria that were discovered by the Alvin expedition are not some special branch that's adapted to an extreme environment. They are the foundation. We are the special branch that occurred much later. But of course, everything here I was talking about organisms, because for organisms you can draw trees. If we had talked instead about ecosystems, I could have done even better, because I could have answered an enormous amount with only one question. Where do they get their energy? Because if we draw the boundaries big enough, every ecosystem is self-provisioning. We don't live off of organic molecules from space anymore, if we ever did. So everything that is needed in an ecosystem is made by somebody in the ecosystem. There, the major division is between the ones that live from electron donors without oxygen and those that are powered ultimately by light on the surface. But we learned something more. kind of like Tolstoy's happy families are all alike, and the unhappy ones are unhappy in their own way. The reductive ecosystems are actually all essentially alike. They may not be the same at the level of organisms, but at the ecosystem level, they're doing the same thing. Moreover, the process of building up biomass, the way these bacteria that oxidize iron and leave rust as their waste product do, is essentially also present in here, but it's wrapped in an energy suit where sunlight provides them what they're no longer getting from the Earth's battery. So these are actually the fundamental and the deep. So that leads us to a different view of the biosphere. Ecosystems are not merely communities, they're entities in their own right. The reason this matters for the origin of life is threefold. First, the kinds of ecosystems, reductive or oxidative, are not primarily determined by genetics or history. They're primarily determined by metabolism. Second, the similarity of metabolisms is evident, or the universality of metabolism can be seen at the ecosystem level, not necessarily at the organism level. So organisms cut up a puzzle in different ways, but the picture on the ecological puzzle is always the same picture. Here's the one that I need to argue to get you to accept. It was not organisms that were the bridge from geochemistry into life, it was ecosystems. The division of becoming special organisms came later. So now I want to make the argument for plausibility for that. To understand that argument, though, we need to look more at metabolism, because metabolism is the special property. And there are clues in the structure and the energetics of metabolism that are as remarkable as anything I've showed you in the world of organisms. Now, usually if you look at metabolism, you of course instantly have a heart attack, and that's because we study metabolism from the level of human physiology and medicine. It's kind of like taking a beautiful telescope and looking through the wrong end and saying, it all seems so far away. So this is what a typical metabolic map looks like in one of the major databases. But even in this chaos, your eye is drawn to the order at the center, this circle. What I want to show you is that this circle is in fact the knot that ties the whole thing together. It does in the entire biosphere, all living things, and apparently has throughout all of history. So this is what the core looks like a little bit closer. It's called the citric acid cycle. It's a cycle of 11 simple molecules. The colored dots here are carbons. I don't label them. The smallest has only 2 carbons. You go around to as many as 6 carbons. That's citric acid. We were all, well, some of us were taught in high school biology that this cycle is important. It's called the Krebs cycle. We were told we need it to get energy from fats and oils so that we can live. That's why it's important to us. But we're late and we're backward. The reason the citric acid cycle is important to everything, and this is stunning, all molecules that you use to make the entire biosphere originate in one of 4 or 5 compounds in this cycle. All the diversity that you see around you comes later, but the building is all done from these. Now, I show them to us in the form of foods because we are not ecologically complete, so we know most of them in terms of the foods we need to eat to live, that some plant or bacterium needs to make. So this little 2-carbon compound, this is vinegar, and it's the starting point through which all of the oils and fats are made. The 3-carbon compound here makes all of the sugars, which are structural as well as energy molecules. This one here makes the special vitamins that bind metals, and that's why they have bright colors, so chlorophyll and heme. There are 4 different ones that make amino acids that are part of proteins, and then from some of the amino acids, we also make the nucleic acids, RNA and DNA. So that's how the major classes of molecules come off of this small, simple core. So the first apparent problem with obtaining an origin of life, the problem of complexity, now doesn't seem so bad. But that's not the only problem we have to address. There's a classic view of life as a struggle for existence. The term was coined by the Victorian Reverend Thomas Malthus, who was worried about population and famines and wars. And this was a term that was adopted also by Darwin and was fundamental to why natural selection can work. You overproduce and then you cull. The same language permeates the sciences. We talk about capturing resources or harnessing sunlight energy. So the intuition is that things fall apart and that you're in the Sisyphean task of building up against the forces of decay. And in the oxygenic world, that's right. If I take organic carbon, I can put it in a furnace and it'll burn and it'll go back to carbon dioxide, which is where it started from. But in the world of vents, the rules are different. My colleague and friend Everett Schock has probably put this best, that instead of no such thing as a free lunch or a struggle for existence, the vent world is a free lunch you're paid to eat. I'll show you how. What I've done here is taken the citric acid cycle compounds. They're the 11 different dots. For a couple of them, I've drawn the molecules just so you can see where they go. And on this axis, I've showed how many H2, how many electrons we add per carbon to build the molecule. So the sugars are 2 H2s per carbon, the oils are 3. And then on this axis, I've shown the energy that's used to make the molecule starting from hydrogen and CO2, because hydrogen is what the vent world provides. And actually what you see is this is a downhill run all the way to methane here at CH4. That's our greenhouse gas. So in the vent world, you are not building up complexity as a struggle against the release of energy. You're building up complexity because that's the path of least resistance to release energy. Now, the reason that matters to the citric acid cycle I showed you before is that that's what drags the cycle around. You can think of it as an old-fashioned water wheel, where as the water flows over, it pulls the cycle around. This is the same picture. I'm not showing you the other clutter, the hydrogens and oxygens, but I show you the same molecules. And the redder a carbon atom is colored, the more oxygens it has bound to it. The bluer it's colored, the more hydrogens it has bound. So you're sliding down the hill as more of your atoms become blue and fewer of them red. This is the citric acid cycle in the same picture, where I'm showing you each of the 11 molecules with only the carbons colored. And what you can see, the cycle goes in this counterclockwise direction. In the vent world, we run it backward, the wrong way, where it makes no sense. But in the vent world, red carbon, that's carbon dioxide, comes in, and as it goes around, it gets moved toward the interior of the molecule, and electrons get added. So that process of adding electrons and using the available free energy drags the cycle around in the directions that the organisms use, and then that becomes the starting material out of which they build the rest of biomass. I'll come back and show you this a little bit later in a slightly different form. So for now, the way the Earth provides a battery and the way metabolism use it shows the essential continuity between geochemistry and biochemistry. That by itself would not be enough to judge whether the presence of life on Earth is surprising or inevitable. To answer that question, we need to do something more. And that's what requires that we reconsider what we think the living state is and what the right kind of formal model for it is. I want to argue that the way to understand, the way that makes sense of the fact that life emerged on a lifeless Earth and that it has persisted for almost 4 billion years since is the concept of breakdown or failure. So remember that we're trying to understand a pattern of motion. Breakdown creates patterns of motion at the same time as it destroys certain patterns of structure. So things don't only fall apart. Sometimes the events become ordered even as the structures are broken. And so we have the concept that the origin of life could be a kind of collapse. And once you have a collapse, the idea that when pushed hard enough, anything will give, that brings with it the notion of necessity. Because in the world of breakdowns, the things that persist are only the things that were the favored state or the necessary state to begin with. Now, this is not an exotic idea. It turns out that it's around us all the time. The main thing you need in order to understand it is the idea of an energy flow channel. There are lots of energy flow channels in the natural world. Lightning is one. We create a plasma that's very, very, very different from the surrounding dry air, but it allows electricity to flow. We create all this organization of wall storms in a cyclone because that transports heat from the warm oceans to the upper atmosphere. And this is not the disordered pattern of just thunderstorms or uniformly mixed air. So these things are well understood in the physical sciences already. The thing that's important to create a channel, and the reason not all things form channels, is that there needs to be feedback. Because in all of these systems, the initial stress is diffuse. The clouds have a charge spread out over a great distance, or the oceans are warm over an enormous volume, but the ice storms concentrate only in one area, because that moves things more. So I'll illustrate for you dynamically with the simplest of all channels, which is just the propagation of a fracture. If you could see a fracture propagating at the atomic scale, you would see that it's a self-similar, repeating sequence of events as bond after bond breaks. The reason this is striking is that in the original crystal, there's plenty of energy in the crystal as a whole to break the bonds, but the energy is too diffuse, and so by itself, it can't concentrate to rupture a bond. The thing that causes the fracture to propagate in an orderly way instead of happening at random everywhere is that the stress field in the surround, as it deforms, pulls the stress from the bulk back down to atomic diameters and concentrates it. This is what hydrothermal vents are doing for the Earth battery, because the battery is accumulating over the entire atmosphere and interior, but it's being focused at the regions where rock contacts water and the regions where the altered water remixes with seawater. Now I want to show you that this is actually what the citric acid cycle does within chemistry. It performs a second kind of concentration. So, as the molecule goes around, it pulls in carbon, and then here it splits, and both parts go back into the cycle. So where you had one, you now have two. That's the mathematics of compound interest. And so you can exponentially grow, and you concentrate material within the cycle. Also, like compound interest on an endowment, you can pull molecules off of this to make your major classes of biological matter, but the material in the cycle is still available to serve as a kind of flypaper that continues to pull carbon in over and over again. So this is the second concentration. Now this leads to an important way of thinking about the nature of life. You could imagine that the optimization of this cycle was something carried out by evolution later, but I think there's actually a better way to view it. This cycle is self-amplifying. It works from the environmental sources of carbon. It works from the Earth's sources of electrons, and everything in the biosphere is made from it. The biosphere is what you can make if these are the compounds you have. And so this is why it becomes the core that organizes the whole rest of metabolism. So does this give us a complete theory of origins? Not nearly. There's a lot of work to be done. There are many problems to be solved, and maybe many generations, maybe centuries of work before we have a satisfactory theory, the way we have a theory of matter. But it fundamentally changes the way we ask questions. When Darwin was trying to understand the origin of the world, even though he was a consummate ecologist, he emphasized organisms because that was where he could say something concrete about the action of selection. His problem was to understand the patterns of relation, the fact that some things are more similar to each other than they are to others. And that was what led him to the importance of the tree of descent, the idea that the degree of similarity could be understood in terms of how long ago you had a common ancestor. But organisms, as we said, are very complicated. And the tree of descent doesn't seem to do a very good job of explaining how you ever arrive at that level of complexity. This is the point that Jerry raised in the introduction, that what organisms are is both part of the living biosphere, but they're also individual, and those are two different things. Today, we would separate the problems, and I would say we ask the same question the following way. We recognize that being an organism, or being a virus, or being a gene, or being a cell in an organism, is just one of many kinds of individuality. And these forms of individuality almost condense like dew from a kind of a background of chemical regularity, and that regularity is being carried by the ecosystem. But like dew, which doesn't condense everywhere, the forms of individuality condense where they have paths of least resistance laid down that make it easy. And so the important point about all of the concentrating mechanisms in organic chemistry, the cycles in metabolism, the Earth's battery, these define the paths of least resistance. So we can come finally back to the question of chance and necessity. There are two sort of classic pronouncements, each made by a major and truly great scientist, that reflect exactly opposite points of view. Jacques Monod worked on bacterial regulation and was one of the discoverers of how this works. His view from all of the complexity of genetics and genomic regulation was that life could be understood in terms of scientific principles, but there was no hope of predicting. He envisioned the trajectory of the biosphere through history as a kind of a random walk, where even the major steps could not have been foreseen. Christian de Duve took exactly the opposite point of view in a way that's very subtle and I think gets missed by many people. De Duve recognized, of course, that the assembly of a modern cell would only be possible with selection because there are so many choices, they have to be selected at each range. But he went on to say something more delicate. He said, even the problem of producing the choices that selection can act on is so complicated, it's very difficult to understand how that could happen in a process where everything is equally probable. And this was what led him to propose that the success of the evolutionary game, as he puts it, was written into the fabric of the universe. What I've wanted to show you in the earlier parts of this talk is where in chemistry and in the properties of our planet those choices were laid down. So I have many people that I need to thank for this. I absolutely want to thank Jerry not only for the privilege of giving you this talk, but for supporting my work and the work of my collaborators for more than a decade. I want to thank a friend, William Melton, who supported us through the last 2 years in which this book was brought to completion, and Jerry also supported me during that time. Of course, the National Science Foundation for bringing the community together, and the 3 places. Yeah, most importantly, Santa Fe Institute, that were home for so many years. Yes, please.
Earlier in your talk, you mentioned hydrogen is being lost by the Earth, but the Earth was gaining something. Is it capturing solar wind or something else?
No, the oxygen is being left behind. I should stand where I'm expected. The oxygen is being left behind, so what you're doing is you're losing oceans, but you're only losing the hydrogen part of the oceans. Good?
Yes, but are we also gaining anything from the solar wind?
Some, but probably not a lot. We're not gaining water. We might, I don't know, it's a great question. I don't know what the rate of gain of hydrogen is from the solar wind quantitatively. I know it's less than the rate of loss, but I don't know by an order of magnitude how much less. Thank you, good. In the back, yes, please.
So you're likely familiar with the debates on whether viruses are considered alive or not. I imagine, at least I've heard of cases where a virus can be as simple as just a replicating molecule like RNA or DNA surrounded by a protein coat, not doing anything like metabolism. So do you think that means it is not alive?
Great. Yeah, lovely question. I'm going to answer that by saying that the whole question turns out to use a form of English that's not meaningful. In the following sense. So here's a little bit of logical semantics. Work with me and tell me if this works for you. If I use the term living thing, a thing is a noun, living is a predicate, right? What that means is I imagine that I can take the whole world of things, which are fundamental, and I can divide them into 2 sets, the living ones and the non-living ones. But if things are not fundamental, and if life is not a property inherent in things, then the whole notion living thing is a set of words. They satisfy the rules of syntax, but it's not clear they actually mean anything. So what happens if the property of being alive is defined by participating in the order of the biosphere, all the things that build it up, all those that break it down, and what we're seeing in cells and viruses is a form of individuality. Now I say, is a virus one of the forms of individuality in its life cycle when it's just RNA in a coat? Absolutely. And we can talk scientifically about what's special about that form, what makes it different from a cell. But I don't ever ask the question, is the virus alive or not? Because the virus is part of the biosphere, and it partakes of the character of the living state from the biosphere as a whole. So that's a little bit heavy as a way to answer a very good question, but I think it's the answer that will stand the test of time. I'll come right back to you. Yes?
I read there are some, at the Big Bang, at the beginning of that kind of life, that what preceded it was a consciousness or the idea for the universe to grow. So could you apply that to what you're talking about here, that there was a consciousness that helps to move this or create the origins of life and create, a place for that life to grow?
That's not a language I have the ability to use in any comfortable way. In a very particular sense, right? I could say that once a snowflake is formed by commonplace processes, we can talk about aspects of the pattern that makes one snowflake different from another. And in a similar sense, I can go through the emergence of life on a planet, and then organisms, and then nervous systems, and somewhere late, I have these incredibly complicated patterns that we just barely understand. And for me, it's natural to look for consciousness as a character of patterns at that late level. But in the same sense as I would not ask whether something about the snowflake was before the properties of water because it seems to be at the wrong end, I'm not able to use a language that puts consciousness at the low level.
As a form of non-physical energy. We talk a lot about physical energies, but we don't talk about non-physical energies, and consciousness could be considered, if it's thought of that way, then it predates everything. It doesn't come after the snowflake, comes before the snowflake. No, anyway. I just wonder if the sciences don't all kind of talk with each other, and I think there's some ways to where there's interdisciplinary study there. I'm just questioning.
I think it's wonderful that you ask. I think it's a right conversation to have. I think it's very hard to talk and to listen both. And I will admit that my view is pretty much a mechanic's view of a great many things, and perhaps that limits the set of things I can say.
Well, I think you have largely answered the question I was going to ask, and it is indeed the idea. I understand how you followed this path of metabolism of energy into living forms as a necessity, and how it comes to be, and that hypothesis is new to me. But I'm missing the same thing: the difference between the rock and organic and inorganic. Inorganic carbon and carbon, whether or not what we've always called the life cycle or the carbon cycle, the things you learn in chemistry. The particular properties that tell us whether or not the energy is living or non-living in that whole origin and metabolism. Have you given any thought to that? I think you've already answered it in the last thing you said, but what are your own thoughts about that, and do you have any idea of using the scientific method to try to discern that?
Good. So that has some words in it that I can address, because I know how to use them carefully. The notion of energy is one that we have struggled tremendously to get clear for the last 250 years. And one of the great triumphs, I think, of a unification in science is that energy is energy. And so it's precisely because the role of energy in the non-living world and in the living world is the same role that we can understand how the living world embeds in the non-living world. And so that's not a place where I think it's correct to look for differences. I think humans are great at, when they haven't seen something, imagining something different from the truth. Paths of least resistance and failure modes are incredibly complicated, and we've only figured out a few of them. I think there's huge scientific mileage in learning how to do that in the domains of dynamics and of chemistry, where we're just babies. We've only begun to form science in those domains.
Does every hydrothermal vent have life associated with it? And are the chemistries the same across all those different vents? So they've all been created de novo, but all been the same?
Superb question. Yes, no, and no. No. If I could give you an hour-long talk on only this one subject in a university department, the things I would tell you. So first thing to realize, there is no place we have ever drilled, dived, or flown in the earth that we have not found life, which is one of the reasons it's so hard to understand origin, because everything has been colonized by somebody modern. So not only does every vent have life in it, every mine shaft hole has life in it, everything that gets blown up from the subsurface in a volcano winds up having life in it. So there's life everywhere. There is certainly life that is uniquely hosted by the energy at vents, but your next question is wonderfully perceptive because it is not all the same. The vent chemistry is not all the same, and the life that they host tracks that vent chemistry quite in detail. So the vents that I showed you are the charismatic ones. Let me give you a two-line thing about geology. I told you that the deep rock in the earth has mostly this iron 2+ character to it. When it comes up, it gets oxidized. That's the process of converting what's called mantle into crust. Normally, you don't see mantle on the surface. You only see crust on the surface. And the magmas that make crust, when they interact with water, they create these black smokers that are full of metals, and they have a very acidic pH, 2 or 3. In rare cases, you can actually get some of the material that's supposed to be protected down below exposed on the surface. It can be stripped off by faulting. The picture I showed you of the lithosphere is Oman. It's a place where continent formation actually causes it to be shoved up on the surface of dry land. In those areas, it turns out you do not produce acidic vents, you produce alkaline vents, and you produce enormous amounts of hydrogen. If I showed you the undersea version of those, they do not have black smoke because without acid they don't dissolve metals, they don't dissolve sulfide. Instead, they're white and shimmery and they produce carbonate chimneys in today's oceans. If you looked at those, you would not find tube worms, you would not find crabs or snails or clams or shrimp. You would find only bacteria and archaea. So it would be a very dull picture compared to the one I showed you. But it's enormously important because it turns out, I think the reason, and there's so many things I didn't tell you about even the black smoker world, in spite of the fact that they live on a tiny energy budget far from the sun, those tube worms are actually the fastest grown organisms known. That's the fastest production of biomass of any known system. And I think the reason for that is that we need metals to live, and that's what those vents are producing in profusion. Without the metals, you go into a much sort of more miserly mode of life, where only the most conservative bacteria and archaea can make it. But thank you. Great. And we have a couple people here on the side, too. Yes?
What do you think of the theory of panspermia as the cause of life, and could you define it for the audience?
Yes, with pleasure. Good. So panspermia was the idea that in the non-polemical form, life may not have originated on Earth, it may have originated somewhere else and been transported to Earth. Now, the polemical form, it's really hard to understand how life originated on Earth, and we only had 4.5 billion years to do it. The universe is 13 billion years old, so that's more than a factor of 2. Maybe if we had the whole universe, we'd have more time. Now, that was the old-fashioned version, sort of the 1970s version. There are more modern and more sophisticated versions where people say that some of the things about the electron battery that I showed you are actually stronger on Mars than they are on Earth, and some of the properties of water may have been easier early on. Those are very technical arguments, and I don't know how to evaluate them. I consider those to be the most plausible arguments that there could be important chemistry relevant to the origin of life that could be on a planet other than our own, where the life evolved to some significant degree of complexity and was then transported here. For my own preference, I regard those with suspicion, because I think when we find something difficult, we probably say, oh, that must mean it's impossible. And our understanding is too primitive to draw a conclusion like that at this point. We understand how hard it is to make life on Earth precisely because we understand the chemistry of life on Earth so well. And so is it sensible to go someplace where we understand the chemistry less well, where we have to rely on transport through space to deliver? But then here's the most important thing. If you think my argument has any validity, that we should look at life as a breakdown process so that the only things that persist are the things that were the native state anyway, and you just had to get to them. If life on Earth was not the native state to get into, and it was a more native state somewhere else, then why would it have been a robust thing to build it there and transport it here? Why would it have survived here for 4 billion years without interruption if it was not a thing that would natively form here? Now, that's not strong enough to be a science argument, and I understand its weakness, but that direction is the drift of my not worrying a lot about panspermia.
Hi. Do you agree to the theories of George Wald, who said that life came from an electric strike like lightning that hit the elements, the Earth's primordial atmosphere, and life evolved from that? There was experiments where amino acids evolved into proteins and life form. Do you agree with those theories?
I would not repeat them in the way their original investigators believed them to be true. Again, to speak a little bit carefully, lightning strikes turn out to matter on Earth because they do something very difficult. They take N2, which is a very strong molecule, and they break it up into the forms of nitrogen that wind up being chemically interesting. That may matter, but I think it only matters at the scale of the whole planetary dynamic. The chemistry of the atmospheres is extremely different from the chemistry of life. You remember I said that chemistry in water is very restrictive, and there are a lot of things that you can't do with it. The chemistry of carbon and of metals in the deep subsurface is incredibly similar to our biochemistry, so much so that you can look at enzymes that use metals, and they use them as if they had just taken a mineral center and learned how to harness it for certain types of jobs. Those things were not known when George Wald was writing these things, and I think a lot of the opinions you're talking about come more from Stanley Miller and the followers of Stanley Miller after 1953. His experiments were groundbreaking, but there are two ways you can interpret them. One, you could suppose that those experiments were good models for the origin of life. That, I think, doesn't hold up so well now, though there are still many people who disagree with me. But what you could say instead is, if chemistry in the atmosphere that's so different from biochemistry led to amino acids, many of which are the same as those in biochemistry, what should we be learning about the paths of least resistance in organic chemistry that can cause very different starting points to collapse into a few paths? And then, kind of like trees growing along the waterways in the desert, does biochemistry use the chemicals it does because it's following those paths of least resistance, even if we learned about them in the wrong environment? And there's somebody who really wants to ask another question, and I don't want to cut him off. Okay, so you will be the last one. You've had your hand up 3 or 4 times.
No. I'm almost embarrassed to stand up considering the quality of all the questions here. But as a practical matter, we are so familiar with the term climate change and what's happening in climate change. Is mankind doing anything relative to climate change that would affect your theories in any way, shape, or form? Or is they 2 completely different subjects?
I'm so glad that you got a chance to ask, because it would have been a shame not to hear. I don't think that the things that people are doing affect the theories, but I would like this work to affect the things that people do. So this was the point that Jerry opened with. In biology, too much, we have put ecosystem sensibility kind of in the periphery, and we focused on organisms. And when we interact with the natural world, whether we do it industrially or agronomically, We try to engineer organisms, and we try to influence systems with a few components as if we were building a watch or a bridge. And routinely, it winds up putting us in places where we don't want to be, or where we shouldn't want to be. If biology can anchor ecology more centrally and start to understand the regression of ecosystems towards certain patterns that it's very hard to pull them away from, maybe biology can help us head off misunderstandings in the world of application and make us a little bit more intelligent, or in some cases a little bit more precautionary about what we do. Biology as a science is sound, but biology as a science is not always proactive enough to anticipate the mistakes people are going to make. A more ecological biology may prime us to be a little bit better at second-guessing the things that can go wrong and trying to be careful ahead of time.